In this video, we're going to look at how we can create custom functions and procedures inside the Lua inside command. Now, basically, a function can be considered sort of a self-command combined group of different commands that we can use for a bunch of different purposes. Some functions can simply give us a basic output. We can set up functions that they do some fancy math for us and then back things up. We can even use functions for the purposes of extending the way that the program works if you're creating some kind of artificial intelligence. So the way that functions are written is pretty straightforward. We're simply going to start by typing the word function. This simply says we're declaring a function. Now keep in mind, for your scenario to be able to access a function, it must be run at least once. So if we were in the editor and we go up to Event Editor and go ahead up to Events, create a new event, one of the methods that I almost always recommend is create some kind of scenario start. And at the scenario start, we can go ahead and create a quick little trigger. We'll say scenario started. That's going to be this one right here. Create the new trigger. And then, of course, we can go ahead and add that here. And then what we could do is under Actions, we could create a Lua script. And we could go to something like init Lua, for example. And now in here, all the functions we intend to use for all the different pieces of our scenario can be placed into here. Now they're going to be accessible by all the different events that you have inside your run. For example, if we had a really, really basic function, say hello, we could do something just along these lines. That we could print hello. And now what would happen when we run this scenario is this function called say hello would be saved into memory. So now we'd have the ability to call the say hello function. One little mistake there. Now we have the ability to go ahead and import this at any point and go ahead and say hello. Obviously, this is a very, very basic function, but at the same time as if we had something that did some math or arranged people in a specific formation, this saves us the trouble of having to go through. Now I simply press OK, close that one in, add it in here. And now when I run my scenario for the first time, it will automatically save all those functions into memory so that we can access them later on. All right, let's take a look at the basics here. So we'll go back to our say hello function again. Type in say hello. Since this function doesn't return a value, I'm just going to go ahead and do that. Come down here, I'll go ahead and say the word print hello. And then I'll go ahead and type in the word end. Now, if I were to run this, nothing's going to happen. Now, the reason nothing happened is it basically took this function called say hello and it loaded it directly into memory. So now if I want to actually access this, I could come down here and say hello. And now if I run this, what it will do is it'll say the word hello because it'll take this function, which is absorbing a value, send it over here, trigger this particular action happening, and then display it. Keep in mind, if you're doing any printing action inside of command, you're not going to see this output at all unless you create some kind of message box. Now, just for the purpose of experimenting, let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to use the command send edit message box. We're going to say the word hello, and we're going to use message box technique number 1. Now, even though we're not going to get this output right here, if we run this command, it'll actually pop up and say hello to us so that we know that this particular function worked. This is a very powerful debugging tool if you need to, and there's actually different styles that we can use for the actual output here, depending on what you're trying to achieve. Now, this particular function is not particularly helpful. It doesn't really do much for us at all, but it does show us exactly how powerful this function work is. Now, one of the interesting things here is because we took the time to put this particular function into memory, if we deleted this function, it actually still exists. So if we're actually to run this code, even though the function appears to be gone, it will still pop up with the hello particular command here. The reason this exists, like I said, is once that's in memory, it is in memory for the scenario for the duration of the scenario. So let's go ahead and bring all that back real quick. Now, this particular function, like I said, it doesn't do too much here as far as anything useful for us. But again, it does demonstrate how the idea of functions work. So now what we can do is we can actually expand upon a function and have it actually send values. Now, the purposes of sending values here is if we want to do something specific. For example, if we want to send it a value of, let's go ahead and send it a number real fast. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead to my function, and I'm going to go ahead and add a value inside the parentheses here. In this case, we're going to send a basic string. Coming down here, I'm actually now going to have to send a string, otherwise I'm going to have issues. So I'm going to say, we'll call it friend, keep it simple. And now going back up to here, instead of hello, I'll go ahead and take the value of this string, which now gets put into this variable here, and then is now usable by this function. In this case, I'm going to say hello, a couple spaces, and we'll say str. So ideally, we're going to get a message box in just a minute that takes this value, sends it into here, and then puts it together as the purposes of our message box. Let's go ahead and press that, and you can see it works perfectly. So I could change this down here. I could call this one pal instead, and you'll see it takes this value, loads it in here, loads it in here. Now, not all functions that we need to do something this simple. Sometimes we need a function to do some kind of math function and then go ahead and return the value to us so that we can use it in other places. So that's getting a little bit more complicated, but it's actually relatively straightforward. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another basic function, and I'm going to go ahead and call this add1. Very scientific here. And we're going to send a simple value. I'm going to call it n. So inside my function add1, I'm simply going to say, we'll go ahead and create a temporary variable here. We'll say local sum equals n plus 1. So in this case, we're going to take the value of n, we're going to load it into here, add 1 to it, and I'm going to type in the word return sum. So what this is going to do is make our function return this value. Now I'll simply come down here and press end. So now notice what happens if I type in add 1. We'll go ahead and say 5 and press the run button over here. Nothing. Actually, it worked perfectly. But the problem is that this particular function here sends the value, and then this entire function becomes the value of sum. We didn't actually display that on the screen. So if we wanted to display it on the screen, we'd have to add some sort of output to it. In this case, we're going to take the value that gets returned. In this case, it's going to be 5, which goes low here, into here, plus 1, which should give us a display of 6. When we run the code, you can see that it works perfectly. You can actually get very, very sophisticated with this if you wanted to do so. For example, I'll create a complex sum. I could do something like add 1 to 10, and I could actually even do math to that. I could add 1 to 10 again. So I'd expect my value here to be the sum of these two plus 1, in which case it gives us 22. Now that we have a function, we can actually do reiteration functions as well. I can do something like add 1 to add 1 of, let's say, a value of 10. So now what I'm doing is I'm actually taking the first value, adding 1 to it, and then adding another 1 to it. Now we'll go ahead and now load this into our complex sum just to make things a little bit simpler for us as far as vision goes. Print complex sum. Ooh, looks like we've had a bit of a boo-boo here, and the reason why is because our function add1 is capital O. So we're actually going to have to go in here and I'll make a quick little correction to go ahead and make sure that works properly. And you can see we get a value of 12. So you can see immediately how powerful these functions can be for the purposes of doing all sorts of math or anything that we need to do many times. Now remember, you don't just have to return a numeric value. We could return things like a list, we could return a particular unit, we could return strings, anything that we need to return from any particular values. As you can see, this coupled with the iteration selection gives you a tremendous amount of power over the functionality of command.